So today we get to talk about families. Families are one of those odd things. We don't choose who our family is, yet they have such a large impact on our lives. What we want to do today is we want to define the family, look at the characteristics of a family, the different types of families, communication dimensions within families, family of origin versus family of choice, maintaining families, family tensions, and toxic families. Now, Webster's dictionary talks about a family being a group consisting of parents and children living together in a household. These are people who you see, who understand you, who know the most about you, most likely know your deepest secrets. And they are with you throughout your life. And for that reason, they have a very strong influence on you, as well as a strong influence of where we find conflict often within our lives. How important is biology in families? This is something we really want to consider and talk about as we're going into understanding families. What about foster families? What about adopted families? What about the families that aren't related to you, but you consider them family? Is the biology, such as what we're finding when everyone's going out and testing to see where their genes say they're from and all that, where it's more important as far as the biological connection? Or is it the emotional connection, the strength, the support, and the love? So think about those as we're going through this. Now, families create our earliest sense of identity. They're the ones that give us our names. They're the ones that teach us about who we are and how to act in society, how to interact, our cultural differences. These all originate within families. Families use communication to find their boundaries. Some families, mom and dad talk and the children are to be quiet. Other families, it's a free-for-all. Everyone throws their words in. And of course, this is also where we get our sense of humor, is based on our family. So when you have a free-flowing family with a lot of communication, oftentimes they'll have a little sense of humor or quirks that they understand, that maybe no one else does, but you had to be there, and it's a family situation. Families are also where we originally turn to for support. When we're an infant, when we're a baby, and we're hungry and we're crying, it's them who we expect to show up and help us. And so that bond develops early on for emotional support, when we're distressed, when we're upset. And that carries through life. Families share a history. Family members share genetic material. Once again, is biology, is the genome, is genetics important, or is that emotional and that loving connection? And oftentimes we have different roles. Within a family, you could be the grandson, the son, and the father. Of course, not the same person, but you have those varying roles within the family. You may be the second born or the oldest, but then when you're a parent, you're in a different role. So there is different roles that sometimes can compete with each other. When you're trying to be a good father, sometimes that means you're not being the best son or the best brother or something of that variety, because you have to do something for your child that might be in disagreement with other family members. The types of families that we often encounter. The one we most often hear of is the nuclear family, in which case we have the wife, the husband, and the child, or the 2.3 children, whichever you want to call it. But this is the traditional family model. And this traditional family model really is not the model that we're seeing today. As we've talked about when we were considering our orientation, our gender, and our expression of emotions, etc., that has changed over time. And as cultural differences have occurred, we now have different family models to look at other than the husband, wife, and child. We have extended families. Extended families are your grandparents, your cousins, your uncles, These are extended family. They're not the ones that were necessarily in your life every day, but they make an impact on your life. They're there during the holidays. They're there if, hey, I'm flying into Portland and I need to be there for a couple days. Well, call your Uncle Jimmy. You can stay at his house. They're kind of there as an extra support for you. Now, when divorce rates started to increase in the 50s and 60s in the US, we started developing a step family model. And if you ever watch some really old TV like the Brady Bunch, this is the type of families they're talking about, where you have a blended family. They did not start out together. There was a husband, a wife, or another type of family where they had children, and then a divorce occurred. And then suddenly they find someone else and they integrate that person into their lives. And they try to take over some of the roles of the individual that's no longer with the family because of the divorce. At the same time, they have to be an individual. They have to be unique. So when they try to just fill the shoes, it doesn't work. Instead, step families have a unique situation where they have to redefine roles. And people have to be accepted into the family in order for it to work. Cohabitation. That has become more popular, where it's not necessarily a marriage vow that binds people. It is their connection through shared interests, through love, through family. So they cohabit, and they're not necessarily married in the traditional sense. Single parent families. Now, when you have a family that one of the spouses is no longer there, you have a single parent situation. And then you have your voluntary kin situation. This might be a case of your best friend's family kind of takes you in and they become your family too. They take you on family outings, they share things, they share holidays with you. This is kind of a voluntary kin. Or maybe it's one of your peers. They become close. And so none of you have someone to go home to. So what you do is you make a home of your own, and that's a voluntary kin type of family. Family stories. Now, this is one of the aspects that's very important within families. Each family has their own stories. Courtship is always one. That's the one where they'll sit you down and they tell you the horrible story about how they met, and they will tell it to you at least once a year. And it's really kind of important because it's giving you some of history. So that way, before you were born, your parents were just single people that met somewhere and they developed love and they courted, and maybe they'll tell you about the dorky time your mother brought flowers and your father or your mother was allergic to it and they sneezed all afternoon. Things of that variety. Maybe a failed first date, maybe being introduced through a third party, another friend. So there's always a courtship. And then along comes baby. And with baby, oftentimes you're looking at the birth. Now, in some non-traditional families, how they end up having a child might be a story of adoption, or it might be a case of fertilization and how they had to go through the process just to have the child. And then the child comes along, and you might have a story about, well, on the way to the hospital, your father stopped at every light. I was so angry. I was in labor. I had to get there. So there's a story of that. Stories of survival. This isn't necessarily just of the first generation, such as your parents and you. It may go further back. It may be your great-great-grandfather, your great-great-grandmother came over to the United States from Ireland on a boat during the potato famine. And they have this big story. Oftentimes it's a hero story where they have an ordinary life, and then reluctantly they are forced to change it, and they go through this hero's adventure, and then they come out on the other end and suddenly they're your great-grandfather. And it's just really a cool story. And part of family is just like in culture. You have to live it and you share it. And telling your family stories is one way you share it. And you might find this in courtship, where you tell that person you're interested in, that one you're out on dinner, and you tell them all about, hey, this is how my parents met. Isn't that kind of crazy? And it's kind of that social penetration theory where you're opening yourself up. You're becoming vulnerable and sharing a family story to kind of let the prospective other in the relationship know this is what you're getting into. Family communication pattern theory used to describe how families communicate. Normally in these, we're talking about three basic elements of the parent, the child, and the topic. And based on any one of these, things can radically change in how the story is shared. Such as perhaps with a parent that's a football fan. Well, they've raised you to be a football fan, and so your topic is football, so anything goes. And you feel free, and you're just, yeah, I'll talk about what quarterback I like and what running back is good. But with the same parent, suddenly you have to talk about a hard topic like orientation or gender. You may not feel open with them because that's not how you view them. So it may change. Now there's consensual communication. This is high amounts of both conformity with social standards and conversational standards. And you're kind of being pressured into coming up with a good solution towards an agreement. And we share this oftentimes with our children. So this might be a situation of, well, we're going to get along and we're going to come to a resolution, so we're going to talk this out. I know how many of you had those situations where you're like, all right, we're having a struggle, so let's sit down and talk. And the pressure is coming towards an agreement. And this is one of those where you might see the my friendship shirt or something of that variety, where parents put both kids in one large t-shirt that forces them to be together, or my get along shirt, I guess is what it's also called. There's protective communication, where you have large amounts of conformity with social norms. This might be when you see a TV show where they all sit down to dinner and dad holds the topic of conversation, and then he goes around like a board meeting or like a meeting room and says, well, what are your thoughts on this, little Timmy? What about you, Jane? And just kind of mediates it, but there's high conformity. And if someone varies off the topic, it's brought back. And this would just be actually a form of manners that was taught to children, is that this is how you behave at dinner. And it's really changed over the years, where we had a highly formulated way of talking to now with families, oftentimes it's not as formulated and different topics are explored and shared. And this might come to our pluralistic, where you're not really conforming to those big social norms that you've gotten used to. Instead, you're kind of sharing and expressing, and you're trying to take the perspective of the other person. We've talked about this in the invitational rhetoric. We've talked about this with the phenomenological approach and other approaches. It's a case of where you're trying to express yourself without attacking others, so that way they can understand where you're coming from, and you're open to hearing what they're saying and what they're sharing. It's very important. Laissez-faire communication. This is low amounts of conformity. This is low amounts of organization. It really is kind of almost a pointless conversation going on within a family for a communication dimension, where you're all just kind of, maybe mom's talking about her favorite movie that's coming out, and dad's talking about the stock market, and you're talking about Facebook, and your little brother's going on about Pokemon or something of that variety. So there's really not any communication going on there. It's just people throwing out random words at each other. Here's another way of looking at this graph here, and you can see where it kind of breaks down based on amount of orientation, with conformity, conversation, low conformity. So if you look at this, you can kind of almost place yourself or your family on there and understand, okay, I'm in a family with high conformity and high conversation, so we're kind of consensual, but I really need to talk about something else. So I need to get more towards the pluralistic. So how can I change how I'm communicating to move them? Or if you're in a family with low conversation orientation and high conformity, and there's just topics you don't talk about, but they're important to you. How do you get your family to talk about it? And that's something you'd have to look at and say, okay, how can I express myself? What's the right situation? Where's my family a little less high conformity? You know, at the dinner table, boy, we just sit down, we eat, and dad holds the conversation, and that's it. So that's not the time. But what about when you're out working on the car? Maybe that's like a situation where you can approach different topics with your mother or your father. Or maybe when you're in the family room, and that gives you an opportunity so you can look for ways to move so you can express yourself within the family. Now, family of origin versus family of choice. Marriage is family of choice because you're creating a family there. And in our society, you do not have to marry one particular person. They're not being chosen for you. Instead, you're getting the option of who you marry and what type of family you create. And that will become a legacy for you. Family of origin, of course, is the family you're born into. And you have relationships based on this with mother, father, whether those are good or bad, siblings, maybe step family. But family of origin is the one you're born into. So when you're talking about step family, that's a case of you'd have half family of origin, half family of choice, but if you're the child, it's still not really your family of choice because it's your parent making that choice of who they're bringing into the family. Now, family of choice, this is definitely a voluntary kin group, and sometimes when we don't have a strong family of origin, we create a good family of choice. We go out there and we find people that share thoughts and that we can share stories with and become family with and experience family through them. Now, maintaining families. Now, being positive is one aspect that is important in maintaining a family. If everyone's always negative, everyone's always attacking each other, the family will soon pull apart. For that reason, there needs to be some positiveness in the family. And sometimes this role changes. You know, maybe mom had a bad day at work and comes home and is upset and mad, but dad's in a good mood, so he's there to help lift her up. Or maybe you're the one that lifts up the family. Someone that brings something positive in it, looks at something in a positive way to make the family click. Assurances. Family needs to be there for you, whether it be family of choice or family of origin. When you need family, they're the ones you go to say, hey, I've fallen. Can you help get me back up? Get me back on my feet. And they will be the ones that you know will be there regardless. You know, they're the ones that you can call at 2 in the morning and say, I can't drive. Can you please come pick me up? And they don't even ask. They just get in the car and they come get you. That's the type of assurances. Self-disclosing. This has two aspects of it. The first aspect of it is that they are people that socially we feel we can share information with. That society has taught us, yes, you can have a heart-to-heart with your mother or your father. And so you feel like you should self-disclose to them. But what's more important is the second part where you feel okay being vulnerable around them. Where you feel like, okay, if I share the truth, they won't reject me. Kind of that listening with compassion and without judgment, and just kind of where you feel okay to disclose yourself. That is an important part of maintaining family. And in some cases, that will be a role that might be shared on different situations. Maybe you feel more comfortable talking to your mother about relationships, but you feel better talking to your dad about other struggles you might be facing, such as school or something of that variety. So the roles can be varied, but you have to be able to feel being vulnerable will not be a weakness for you. Now, there are tensions within every family, of course. And I like this little bubble over here because we have different privacy boundaries as we're growing up. And as a child, as an infant, we have no privacy. Someone's coming in, they're changing our diaper. They come in when they want. They don't announce themselves. They just barge into the room with a diaper bag. Guess what? That's the life of an infant. And then as you get a little bit older, you start to develop a little bit of space, a little bit of distance, and you start having different communication boundaries. I mean, as an infant, you shared everything that you were able to formulate, such as I'm hungry, cry, and they brought you food. Or I'm mad, so you could put on a mad face. And so there was always sharing completely with your parents to the limit that you could. Then as a small child, you start sharing information with your parents, but then you start being introduced to friends. And so your privacy boundary grows a little bit, and as it grows, you don't share everything with your parents, mostly everything, but you might have like a secret with your best friend in kindergarten, you know, or you might only share jokes with those other kids in first grade that you won't share at home. Things of that variety. You start developing an adolescence privacy boundary, and by the time you're a teenager, that becomes important. You have to have your boundaries for communication, and you have to have your boundaries for even coming into your room. Yes, the people that used to barge into your room at 2 in the morning to change your diaper now are greeted with a stay out sign, and they can't come in without knocking. And then if they knock, they have to knock 3 times. Definitely, teenagers create more boundaries, and usually they'll start out as like physical boundaries, and then they move to where you're not opening up and you're not sharing information that you once would share with your parents because you're developing your privacy. And then finally, you're an adult. You're on your own, you're living in your house, and you no longer share that information that you used to share with family because you're living your life, they're living their life. And hopefully you can still get together, but you're developing your family of choice. And so your family of origin may become more closed out than they were previously. And then finally, as we enter our elderly years, privacy because of safety becomes less. I mean, if a person that's 80 years old falls, that could be a very dangerous thing for them. So for that reason, they have less privacy. They might have family members coming over unannounced. They might have people coming by with meals. You may end up in a facility for long-term care, those type of things, in which case your privacy boundaries become even a little bit less than even when you were a teenager. You don't have as much privacy, and as with children and with elderly, it's more of a case of promoting well-being versus in the case of intrusion of privacy. Now, family relationships change. This goes back to our step families we spoke about a moment ago. Oftentimes, the important thing is to go slow on the integration of family. If you rush and suddenly you throw in and say, hey, let me introduce you to your new brother and sister, and this is the first time someone's met them and you're walking in the door, that's a lot of pressure. And that oftentimes leads to rejection. So going slowly. Practice daily maintenance. In other words, try to maintain that positive approach. Try to maintain proper boundaries and let them know how you communicate, and also try to let them understand who you are. And practice it daily. And so that way there's a routine, so that way people start getting used to it. I mean, if you have to get up every morning and making breakfast is the big part of your day and they never had breakfast before, don't be insulted if they decide they don't want to have breakfast at first. But you just keep up your routine and hopefully they join in. Create new family rituals. In some families, they try to recreate the family rituals they had with the other family member, with the person that they divorced. And this actually becomes more traumatic for the children during the progress, because what they do is they say, we're doing the same things, but that's not mom or that's not dad. This is the new person you married. And so they reject it, and then they feel hurt, and they're being dragged through previous memories. So change the traditions. Keep the ones that are truly important for the family, but be willing to change the other ones so that that way there's a new bond that is created. Avoid triangulation. This is a hard one. If you have multiple step siblings, 2 of them will gang up on the other one that's new to the family. So you don't want to have a case of, well, if you're with me, you're against them type of situation. Instead, you don't want to have the triangulation. Be patient. Understand there will be some parental favoritism. Being a step parent is not going to be easy. It's not going to be like, oh, well, now that you're here, you're my favorite. No, it's still going to be perhaps their biological child, the person that they helped raise from an infant. There will be some. And there will be conflict between perhaps past spouses and the current spouse, perhaps between the dynamics will remain changing. And so expect some conflict, such as changing a family ritual or tradition might really sour the separated spouse on the new spouse or on the family. So understand there will be conflict. Now, I put this one up here because unfortunately our images of family are oftentimes brought to us by mass media, through television, through movies. And what's the best thing about families is, depending on the length of the show, it's either every problem is going to be resolved in 30 minutes, an hour, and then if you go to the cinema or you go to movies, it'll at least everything will be resolved in 2 hours and there will be a perfect ending. That's not true. Things are rarely resolved rapidly. Rarely everyone comes out happy. And oftentimes one conflict will lead to another conflict. So don't expect the Hollywood family. Don't expect the Brady Bunch. Don't expect, like in fatherhood, don't expect things to resolve rapidly and easily. Now, there are signs that you are dealing with toxic family members, and you should keep these in mind. This doesn't mean they're bad people. It just means your relationship with them isn't working for some reason, and perhaps it's a time to consider how you communicate or the type of interactions you have. Perhaps if there should be therapy or something of that variety involved. If a family member, every time you're around them, you feel sad and down, maybe it's their personality, maybe it's just how they make you feel. Perhaps they always make you feel guilty. Perhaps when you show up, they say, oh, well, you put on a few pounds. They don't mean it as an insult, but you suddenly feel drained. You're like, thanks, you know? So if you're always feeling sad around them, realize that might be not a solid, good relationship, but there might be some toxic in it and some things you might consider doing. You always feel angry around them. You know, every time I see my brother, Sam always makes me mad. I always get pissed off. We always end up in an argument. And it's just, that's a sign of perhaps a family member that you don't need to interact with as much, and that you need to find out, okay, is there a way I can avoid feeling angry? You know, if when we're meeting, well, I'm not going to talk about politics because, boy, every time that sets me off. So, anger. You don't want to go around them. You don't want to see them. That's the problem when you have family of origin and cultural expectations. Mother's Day, Father's Day, Grandparents' Day, all these type of situations are saying you need to be around them, you need to go, you need to interact with them, and perhaps you don't. And so you have a feeling that you just don't want to see them or be around them. That's another sign of being in a toxic family. You find yourself having to take care of them. And this isn't necessarily as we're talking about with elder care. This is where we're talking about their dependent personality. So the minute you show up, you just want to stop by, say hi, let them know that you love them. And you walk in the door and it's like, well, you know, I could use the trash taken out. You know, if you want, I could actually have you run down to the store and pick this up for me. Or I'm having issues, let me talk it out with you and you give me the answer. You provide it with me. So you always feel you have to take care of them. And this is kind of the child relationship, but instead it persists throughout lifetime so that we can't just enjoy them. You're always dealing with their situation. And these type of people often leave you feeling drained, where you just everything goes out of you. So those are more signs. You feel numb around them. You just don't feel anything. Being around them just leaves you feeling, you know, you just don't have that connection with them. And you can't say anything right around them. No matter what you say, they correct you. They have the better opinion. They teach you from their experience. And this might be a case of where they feel that they're the wise old family member, but what they're really doing is bringing you down. You feel forced to be around them. You know, if you'd rather be at the movie than being at their house that day. So you feel like it's an obligation and it's something you don't want to do, but you still end up doing it. All these are different signs of a toxic family relationship. There's some things to remember about that. When you start feeling unlike yourself around them, when you have to be someone else, when you have to put on, well, you know, I'm not a sports fan, but I'm visiting Grandpa. Grandpa expects me, so I'm going to go in there and I'm going to talk about hitting the home run in the baseball game for the hat trick type of thing, where you feel that you have to take on a different persona. And you feel like they control the relationship. So they're the ones dictating the persona. They're dictating who you are and how you interact. They're dictating who talks, who gets at the big person table, who gets at the little person table, what time bedtime is, etc. You feel like they control everything, and this includes relationships. They tell you, you know, you shouldn't be seeing that boy, you shouldn't be seeing that girl, and you shouldn't have those friends. Those friends aren't good for you. So they always have some type of control issue. Now, there's some things to remember. Communication is a good way to get through some of those toxic family members. If you can have them listen to you, where you can go up to them and say, you know, what I really want to say is I want to say how this makes me feel. Take ownership of what you're feeling rather than say, this is how you make me feel, which is pushing blame on them. Instead, take ownership and say, okay, I'm not getting along well, and this is why, and hopefully that can be an opening. Some relationships it can, some it can't. But 5 things to remember when dealing with toxic family members. Pretending their behavior is okay is not okay. Perhaps you have a person that always says negative things about people you care about, your friends, and perhaps they are always attacking you. Those aren't okay things. Bringing you down, making you feel like any of those toxic things is not okay. And for that reason, you have to remember their behavior is not okay. But they may not be bad people. They may have good intentions, and it might be you stepping back to realize what those intentions are, and then finding a way to communicate with them that, okay, you attacking my friend is not okay because they are my friend and they've been here for me and they've done these things for me. I feel that you need to let my friendship be. And they might just be trying to protect you. So they're not always bad people, but their behavior is not okay. If you can, forgive them. If you can step back and see where they're coming from and see, okay, I understand the reason that they have a problem with this, I can forgive them. The main thing to remember about forgiveness is it means putting an end to the conversation about it. Because if you forgive, but the next time you're mad, you bring up that situation again, you haven't forgiven, you've just carried it forward. Okay? You just repackaged it, put it back, and now you're carrying a new burden. So you don't want to do that. Understand too, people do change. We're dynamic creatures. We have different influences. Our sphere of influence is constantly changing. Who we see, our family, all this is constantly changing, different stages of life. So if you can learn to communicate with family members, perhaps some positive change in your relationship can come about, or perhaps something will occur to them that will change who they are and how they interact. So people can change. But the main thing to remember is no matter if it's family of choice or if it's family of origin, if that relationship is damaging to you, if that relationship is hurting you and hurting your life, it's okay to walk away. You can. It doesn't matter when, it doesn't matter how. You shouldn't feel obligated to remain in a relationship because it is family. Instead, you need to take care of you, and for that reason, if you need to, walking away can be a solution. So what we really wanted to talk about today: defining family, characteristics, family of choice, stories, communication dimensions, family of origin versus family of choice, maintaining families, tensions, as well as what a toxic family looks like. Now, you get to choose your friends, as they say, but you don't get to choose your family. But you can choose how you interact with the family. You do have control within your life to make it so that you live a happy and healthy life. And if you have any questions, you can email me, you can message me on D2L, or reach out to me. I'll be glad to answer them for you. And don't forget, on Friday, we're going to have our group meeting. So anyone that wants to join us at 3 o'clock, please feel free to. No obligation there. Go out, enjoy yourself, stay healthy, and I'll see you next week.